For as long as there have been devoted fans of games, there have been fan games. All sorts of projects ranging from little programming tests to full-on passion projects existing today. The threat that faces most of these is depending on the company that owns the property, a high-effort project could easily see a premature end in a flash. However, if that doesn't happen and a fan game continues through the efforts of passionate developers, you get something like Sonic Robo Blast 2. Bearing the title of first 3D Sonic fan game, Roboblast 2 has really become quite the game ever since its development began in 1998. So not only do I want to gush about this incredibly cool fan game, I also want to show how this project went from this to this. Hello everyone, this is the RPG Monger, and today I'll be talking about Sonic Robo Blast 2. Having humble origins as a little freeware 2D platformer made in the games factory, this initial version of the game would quickly get scrapped in favor of its 3D platformer iteration that we know today, which in actuality is built on an incredibly modified Doom engine. At its core, Roboblast 2 adheres to a single design philosophy, capturing the feel of playing a classic 2D Sonic game and translating that over to 3D as faithfully as possible. And to achieve that lofty goal, there'd be a fair amount of trial and error. Featuring a decent variety of modes in both single-player and multiplayer, let's first focus on the core of the game, its main campaign. Here, in classic Sonic fashion, you have a few options for which character you want to play the story with, 3 more getting unlocked by completing certain parts of the mode. There's Sonic, who along with being the fastest, has this double jump speed-up hybrid that'll send you in the direction the camera is facing. There's Tails, who's slower and can fly up into the air. There's Knuckles, who can climb walls and glide through the air like in the games, and then there's the classic combo of Sonic and Tails, it working like you'd expect. Obviously, they can all spin dash too. As a recommendation for newcomers, coming from someone who played as Sonic in their first playthrough, I'd suggest starting with one of the other characters. He's definitely a blast to play as, but it took some time getting used to his momentum, especially for more precision platforming. And in the mode itself, everything adheres to the classic formula like you'd expect, each completed zone featuring 2 levels, a boss fight, and a special stage you can access to get a Master Emerald. I say completed because despite how polished this game has become in its many years of development, it's still not done yet. More on that later. With the first level in Greenflower Zone, these 2 acts have a lot of history behind them. The first act here served as one of the first building blocks to this game's initial 3D versions. Even now in the game's current version, the very beginning of this stage is nearly the same, which is nice to see. In those first demos, the potential of what the devs were making here was already very clear, with the momentum you can build in these stages being extremely satisfying. That aspect manifests far more in the second act, where you can really go all out, zooming around the map and uncovering little areas hidden in plain sight. I especially loved messing around in the clearing you get to halfway in. The attention to detail everywhere is great. The music that plays in Act 2 immediately became one of my favorites from this game. And if you manage to find the Emerald tokens hidden in either stage, you'll be taken to a special stage to obtain a Chaos Emerald. This especially was really neat, since while in co-op mode, the special stage is a take on the classic orb collection mode, in single player, it just puts you into nights into dreams. Showing the devs' love of not just Sonic, but the games of Sonic Team, this little mode is a fun iteration of the Knights gameplay, with more challenging maps appearing later on. Then with the boss at the end of the stage, it's a pretty standard Eggman fight, just in 3D. Though believe me, these get harder later on. If all of this sounds fun to you so far, I highly suggest you try the rest of the game out for yourself before I continue, as it's a free fan game, just about all of you can play it if you have functional computers. So moving on to the next level with Techno Hill Zone, these acts underwent a fair bit more change than Greenflower did in its history. In its first act, it originally started out somewhat similar to Greenflower, except with some more mechanical elements and hazardous pawns strewn about. In terms of layout, it's actually pretty similar to its modern incarnation, just far more barren. The main difference being that eventually the hazardous liquid would be swapped out for a kind of bouncy substance that you can use to reach higher up places. Definitely an improvement that makes the act far more enjoyable to navigate, not to mention it opens up more avenues to hide secrets. However, in its second act, things would not stand the test of time like everything until now, because where you can definitely see the old and the new with all the stages so far, Techno Hill Act 2 would be completely revamped. Ditching the toxic waste like its first act, Act 2 utilizes the bouncy liquid much more, with the map overall becoming much better to navigate compared to its earlier versions. That's not to say they completely ditched its origins, as its history lives on through the sections employing conveyor belts and other fun factory-themed settings. This goes for all the stages honestly, but once you familiarize yourself with the act layout, it feels so great being able to zoom through them. Ramping the challenge up slightly, I appreciate how they used this stage as an opportunity to start introducing minor puzzles to the player. It's a good balance between precision platforming and going as fast as you can, though the boss fight at the end is pretty simple. In Deep Sea Zone, this is where I started to die a bit more, with vast portions of these two acts being underwater. That's not to say I didn't enjoy them, however, as they're both pretty creative. Compared to their earlier versions, the modern renditions of the Deep Sea acts are drastically different, with multiple reworks and improvements being made to the both of them over time. In the first act, this one serves to acclimate the player to a mix between underwater and above water portions, air bubbles placed all around. But even with that, I still managed to find new innovative ways to drown despite the game's best efforts. By far my favorite thing in these two acts are the neat waterslide segments that send Sonic in all sorts of directions. In actuality, these were one of the older mechanics from this zone, so it's great to see them retain the best aspects of previous versions. It was always really interesting to me how Sonic games would create multiple paths in a level to reach the goal, and I'm glad they kept that alive here. I feel those platforms that rise up caught everyone by surprise at least once. Also, the visuals here are really nice. Keeping the game within its graphical limits, all the sprites and textures in each act are super crisp. You can even toggle 3D models on if that's what you prefer. I personally prefer the sprites, but the low poly style they went with for the models fits in perfectly with everything else. It's all a definite far cry from some of the earlier sprites, with Knuckles infamously being a bit crusty in the past. Crazy to think that this is actually the earliest point of the game that's unfinished, with Act 2 of Deep Sea Zone slated to be significantly redesigned in a future update, though that's nothing compared to the king of redesigns, Castle Eggman Zone. Dating back earlier than Deep Sea Zone, funnily enough, this level was originally an unlockable final stage of the game in some of the first versions. Back then, it was a pretty rough stage to say the least. In all honesty, at first it was kind of a combination of all the worst aspects of early Sonic Robo Blast 2, with enemies haphazardly strewn about, narrow twisting corridors combined with massive barren open areas, and annoying switch puzzles to boot, which makes it all the more impressive that they went from this to this. Well, after a fair amount of different ideas on where to take the zone, that is. With the gradual introduction of chains you can grab to launch into the air and a forced setting to the first act, things begin to look more like they do now. And even with these reworks, the level design still wasn't up to snuff, leading to yet more reworks to the point that one of them became its own offshoot secret stage. So finally, when the devs perfected Castle Eggman, it became a major highlight of the game to me. Being the first zone in my opinion that raises the difficulty by a significant level, it's pretty easy to get caught by stage hazards here, making it all the more rewarding when you manage to overcome them. In the first act, this portion is made up of the castle's courtyard and general road leading to it, the whole atmosphere becoming noticeably darker compared to the previous zones. Personally, I love the gloomy castle surrounded by forests. It's a great background for when you're sent flying halfway across the map. And to top it all off, the end of the act surprises you with a fast-paced segment across a crumbling bridge. After all the stage design attempts that led here, this game is the perfect example of what happens when you never give up on a project. This shows even more in the second act, with this whole act being a great balance between challenge and fun. From even more launching segments to plenty of spiked balls in your way, there's a good few parts here that had me pretty tense while playing. As opposed to the bare stone passageways it came from, the variety seen here in this act makes it almost unrecognizable compared to its origins. Personally, my favorite section here is the clearing you hit around the middle of the act, where they even added a little hedge maze. I love small details like that. Much like the second act of Deep Sea Zone, this one isn't finished either surprisingly, more parts plan to be added at some point. So once you get past both these acts, here's the first boss that's actually worth talking about. Coming with a pretty large difficulty spike as far as fights in this game go, this boss has you multitasking by avoiding 3 spinning rows of spikes, all the while trying to hit buttons to make Eggman vulnerable. It seems pretty straightforward at first, but trust me, with the ground crumbling after every hit you land and the spikes spinning faster, it soon becomes really chaotic. The worst is when you're so used to avoiding the spikes that when they change the direction they spin, it completely robs you of all your rings. And as if that wasn't already challenging enough, the final phase requires you to hit Eggman while he's flying in the air. It took more tries than I'd like to admit to finally figure out how to get him. He would have gotten me for good if he'd signed up to Brilliant. What's that, you ask? Well, Brilliant, the sponsor of this video, is a learning platform with thousands of lessons geared towards math, science, and even more advanced subjects like computer science. I myself have had a growing interest in computer science and programming lately, so Brilliant has been great for me. On top of its variety of STEM-focused lessons, they're designed to give you a more hands-on approach to the topics that I found facilitates learning much better. Brilliant's also great if you're running on a pretty tight schedule due to a certain pesky hedgehog. Just pop in for 30 minutes a day and you'll still learn a good amount. How else do you think Eggman became a doctor in the first place? So whether you're looking to touch up on some subjects you're rusty on or curious to learn something more advanced, head on over to brilliant.org/therpgmonger to get started for free. The first 200 people who go to the link on screen and in the description will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thank you, Brilliant, for sponsoring today's video. Now, with Castle Eggman done and the new difficulty level established, next is Arid Canyon Zone. Going through a good amount of reworks and being the result of two much older stages being merged into a single concept, Arid Canyon Zone combines a lot of fast-paced segments and precision platforming with a more western setting. As you'd expect, this makes for a lot of cute set pieces that fit right in with your usual Sonic gameplay of going fast. There's even roads for you to speed down. Keeping up the difficulty set before, Arid Canyon's main initial gimmick are these rope pulleys placed around the map. For a good few portions, the only way to traverse the stage is through these ropes, this proving to be my downfall a fair number of times as I got used to them. Throughout all this trial and error, it helped a lot that the theme for this act goes all in. Nothing softens the blow of constantly dying quite like bangers like these. The game is practically full of them, though in my opinion, Arid Canyon truly shines in its newly released second act. It still has much of the gameplay established by the first act, except with the notable addition of these minecart segments. Again, it took me more than a few deaths to get used to, but once you figure out the right tracks to jump on while in the minecart, your quick thinking gets rewarded by one of my favorite scenes in this game. That train wasn't just a neat little closer to the act either. It's the arena for this zone's boss fight. Changing things up from yet another battle with Eggman, this zone has you fight Fang the Sniper, a lesser-known Sonic character originating in Sonic Triple Trouble. Along with a really cool track, this fight is incredibly dynamic, with Fang jumping around, throwing bombs, or shooting at you. All I'll say is don't be like me in his second phase. I swear, trying to damage him as Sonic led me to my doom so many times as I dashed directly into the void. Though following that in Red Volcano Zone, this zone is especially unique since as of writing this, it currently only has one act. Much like how Arid Canyon Zone used to be up until 2019, the second act of Red Volcano Zone is currently in development at the moment. Still, that doesn't take away from its first act, with this stage featuring some pretty unique sections for a lava-themed act. Instead of purely being composed of various lava rooms like it used to, Red Volcano is now a bit of a mix between said lava segments and outdoor areas that go for a jungle vibe. Funnily enough, in one of those old versions, the only way to access this zone was by being sent to hell. So in the newest remake of this act, you've got to once again think fast with all the platforms that fall into the lava. I appreciate how the act keeps up variety by switching between regular platforming and those rock riding portions, though I will say those flying enemies outdoors did get a bit on my nerves. That lava wave was really cool despite how anxiety-inducing it can be, and that's about it with Red Volcano Zone. Seeing how nice its first act is now, I'm looking forward to when they finish Act 2. Which brings me to the game's finale, Egg Rock Zone. Like you'd expect, this is by far the hardest portion of Sonic Robo Blast 2's main campaign. Unlike many of the zones I've talked about until now, surprisingly, Egg Rock hasn't received a single massive overhaul. Instead, the main modifications it's had are devs removing or modifying things to make the acts more doable. Believe it or not, this zone was actually even harder in the past, which on a side note, as someone who only discovered this game somewhat recently, is absolutely mind-boggling. Even in its current state, these acts rob me of so many lives. Featuring a vast array of different stage mechanics from reversed gravity to surprise space segments that had me panicking to get to the nearest area with air, Egg Rock is no joke. By far the bane of my existence in this zone were all the conveyor belts in that massive lava room. It's one thing trying to keep your momentum in check as Sonic, but when you have to also do it upside down, I couldn't stop dying. A runner-up to that was that other portion where you have to jump across disappearing platforms. That took a fair amount of my sanity too. I feel like even veterans of this stage will still succumb to at least a few deaths in the portions without air. Though suffering aside, I really enjoyed how the second act has you ascending the space station to reach the finale. Only after Act 2, there's one other thing before this game's current final boss. You thought Egg Rock was hard, it's just an appetizer when faced with the Metal Sonic race. I don't even know how many times I retried to beat this, because while this was also harder in the past, Metal Sonic doesn't leave much room for error, with the course featuring all sorts of platforming challenges from the game with the added bonus of occasional reversed gravity. Nothing hurt more than finally making it further into the lava room only to be killed by Metal Sonic draining all the air in the area. Back when I played this game for this video's footage, I distinctly remember having to put the game down here just to take a breather from all the death. However, once you finally make it past all that, Metal Sonic also has a proper boss fight. Not destroying me nearly as much as that race, of course, this fight is still a hard one. Keeping track of where Metal Sonic goes along with trying to damage him is harder than it looks. Then there's this game's current final boss, Black Eggman. Inspired by the antagonist with the same name from the 1996 Sonic OVA, this fight gets hectic fast as you try to trick the boss into becoming vulnerable while also avoiding his long-range attacks. This is when it becomes apparent again that this is in fact a Doom mod. It's easy to forget with how much they built on top of it. Overall, a very solid fight all things considered, since this isn't even the planned final boss to the game. You see, along with all of Egg Rock set to be remade in a future update, there's actually 2 whole zones that haven't been implemented into the game yet. Dark City Zone, that's set to come after Red Volcano, and Grand Eggship Zone, which takes place in between Dark City and Egg Rock. No wonder Egg Rock has such a difficulty spike compared to Red Volcano. Seeing how Black Eggman is actually meant to appear in Dark City Zone, it's wild how good the finale is with just a placeholder fight. Imagine how good it'll be when everything is actually finished. Sonic Robo Blast 2 really is in a league of its own when it comes to fan games, and there's still more to cover. Moving on from the main single-player campaign, there's quite a few more things for you to do. For one, you can go back through it with characters you unlocked. There's Amy Rose, who gets unlocked by beating a secret stage hidden behind emblem collecting, there's Fang the Sniper, who gets unlocked by beating him in-game, and then there's Metal Sonic, who gets unlocked by completing the single-player mode. So as far as replayability goes, there's a lot here. While those first 2 can be pretty fun, Metal Sonic is so satisfying to play as after you've spent so long trying to beat him in the race. Outside of the normal stages, there's also bonus ones locked behind emblem collecting and challenge stages. Focusing on the challenge stages, these are a real test of how good you've become at this game, with Spookums, Bees, and the Ungodly Nightmare. The first 2 were decently manageable with the exception of some more painful jumps in the ladder, but man, I never want to look at Azure Temple Zone again. There should be a law against making a stage that's entirely underwater, though at least stylistically, Haunted Heights Zone is my favorite out of the 3. That theme in it is an absolute banger. And if you've had your fill of all the single-player content Sonic Robo Blast 2 has in store, there's a hefty amount of multiplayer. Aside from the multiplayer mode on the main campaign I mentioned earlier, there's other modes to try out that are pretty fun. While some are slight modifications of the game, like competing to see who can beat levels quicker, there's more unique modes as well. From capture the flag to battle modes, if you can imagine it, they probably made it here. It's pretty insane how much there is to do aside from plain single player for a fan game. And if you still want more after checking out everything in the base game, I haven't even mentioned this game's community yet. On top of everything else, the community that surrounds this fan game actively creates bonus content for it. Whether it be a new playable character or even more stages to explore, there's all sorts of stuff to check out. What's awesome is the devs of the game actively encourage it too. It's great seeing them celebrate all this creativity with yearly design contests. In fact, there's a good chance you first heard about Sonic Robo Blast 2 from one of its fan creations. Like how the game is running on top of a modified Doom, a few years ago, ago, a group of fans would modify it further to create Sonic Robo Blast 2 kart. Originally based on a Mario Kart mode inside a different modification of the game that emulated the gameplay of Sonic Riders, this fully functioning kart racer has a lot more content than you'd expect. With there being over 100 courses, I still haven't been able to race on them all despite me playing a hefty amount. Even with a lot of my footage consisting of me playing poorly, I will still say it's a good amount of fun, if a bit chaotic at times. Never thought I'd see Heavy and II in the same racing game. As someone who's only recently discovered Sonic Robo Blast 2 and its community, it's been quite the time going through everything and seeing how much has been made for and around this game. Above all, I like to give major props to everyone who's worked on it, because with how long Sonic Robo Blast 2 has been in development, its two original developers that started it all have since moved on from the project, meaning in every sense, this game has taken on a life of its own. As devs have come and gone providing various contributions, Sonic Robo Blast 2 has gone from a strange little fan game to one of the hallmarks of fan game creation. While Sonic Robo Blast 2 may not be alone anymore when it comes to quality Sonic fan games, it still remains among the best as an example for others to strive for. I, for one, never could have imagined that one of the best fan games out there had been in development for longer than I've been alive. No matter what direction Sega decides to take the franchise in the future, it's great seeing people come together to bring their ideal vision of Sonic to fruition. So in the years to come, I look forward to following this game as it continues on towards its long-awaited goal of perfection. Hey, thanks for checking out my little love letter to this fan game. Seeing how this is the first time I've ever covered something like a fan game, let me know in the comments or on my Twitter if you'd like to see me cover other fan games like this. Though above all else, I'd like to thank Jack Corvus, Nathan, and the rest of my patrons on Patreon. If you want to support what I do and get some bonus content, like early cuts of videos before they release and behind the scenes videos, do consider stopping by patreon.com/therpgmonger. You know, I really should get around to playing more Sonic games sometime. Straight up, I've only actually played Colors and Mania, so there's a lot out there that I really don't know much about. Who knows, I could even do videos on some of them at some point. Let me know what you all think. So that being said, I'm the RPG Monger, and don't forget that each and every one of you are fantastic.